Hi everyone. Today we are going to be introducing igneous rocks, looking at igneous rocks, how to determine which rock is which when looking at igneous rocks, as well as talk about volcanoes. So for this first video, we're going to go over igneous rocks and how they fit into our rock cycle. We'll also learn about Bowen's reaction series to determine silica content of different magma, or temperature of formation and melt of magma, depending on what the magma is made of. We'll look at the difference between lava and magma, describe where magma forms, and also talk about melt, why melt can move, and how it solidifies where it does. So to get started, let's look at the rock cycle as a whole. So here is a graphic showing our three main rock types. So we have igneous rocks here, we have sedimentary rocks here, and then here we have metamorphic rocks. So the rock cycle is called a cycle because it is constantly moving, constantly cycling. Each rock type can turn into the other rock type depending on what it goes through. So we have our igneous rocks, which we're going to talk about today in these videos. And what happens is we can either have melting of metamorphic rock or melting of sedimentary rock. That melt will become magma. When that magma then again solidifies, it is an igneous rock. So we have either sedimentary or metamorphic rocks can become igneous rocks if they are melted down to magma and then re-solidified from that magma. So when we talk about igneous rocks, of course we have to talk about magma because we know igneous rocks are any solidified magma or lava. So any volcanic rock where the rock solidifies from either magma or lava, we know that that is an igneous rock type. So there are four main magma types, and the type is dependent on the percentage of silica that's present in the material. So a high silica magma would be called felsic. Then we have intermediate, mafic, and ultramafic. So ultramafic is very low silica content. Felsic is very high silica content in that magma. So the composition in terms of is the magma silica rich or silica poor controls the density, the temperature, and the viscosity of that magma. So high silica magma is going to be very viscous. So it will have a high viscosity, more like a syrup, whereas a low silica content magma will be less viscous, so it will be more like water. So it will have a low viscosity. So it will flow more easily than the syrup. And the type of magma in terms of composition, viscosity, density, and temperature is going to determine the style of eruption when that magma does reach the surface. So we see here is a chart with felsic, intermediate, mafic, and ultramafic as the type of magma, and then the associated densities, temperatures, and viscosity. So our felsic materials are a very high viscosity, quite explosive, whereas ultramafic, the viscosity is very low, so it's much more of a flowing eruption rather than something explosive. So if we think back to silicates, we remember that there are the silicate tetrahedras that are linked together by sharing those oxygen molecules. So the more that the oxygen molecules are shared, the lower the silicate to oxygen ratio becomes. Now this changes a lot of properties about the magma, mostly the melting temperature. So the temperature required to melt rock is determined by the silicate to oxygen ratio. as well as how susceptible that material is to chemical weathering. So the next thing to introduce is called Bowen's reaction series. So this is where we're looking at the silica content and then the melting temperatures or solidifying temperatures of different types of rock and magma. So minerals solidify specifically in a set order. So minerals will solidify out of a magma that is cooling in a very specific order or a series. There's both continuous and discontinuous. But when we're looking at a chart such as this, which is explaining the Bowen's reaction series, we see here we have mafic, intermediate, and then felsic. So in this chart, they are calling felsic a different term. We are going to think of this always as felsic, but I liked the rest of the chart. So here we see also according to temperature. So here we have very high temperatures. Here we have very low temperatures, relatively low temperatures. So where we have olivine here, up where we have these high temperatures, what this is saying is that olivine is going to crystallize first, because in order for olivine requires a very, very, very high temperature. So it's one of the first to crystallize, because as that magma is cooling, it's going to cool from an incredibly high temperature. As it cools just a bit, that olivine is going to be able to mineralize or form crystals at that very high temperature. Whereas quartz cannot solidify in very high temperatures. So as an example, olivine is going to start forming much earlier in the cooling process than quartz, because quartz cannot crystallize, cannot solidify out of the magma until the magma has reached a much lower temperature. So as our magma is cooling, the mafic materials, so olivine, for example here, are going to mineralize first. They are going to solidify from within that magma first. As the temperatures continue to cool, other minerals that require a lower temperature to solidify will be able to start forming. So as the magma continues to cool, that's when we will start getting the silica rich minerals, the felsic minerals, starting to solidify out of that magma. So we classify igneous rocks based on the composition and the texture. So the composition, what we mean by composition is the rock felsic, intermediate, mafic, or ultramafic? And then by texture, we look at, is it fine-grained or coarse-grained? So fine-grained, meaning it has very, very, very small grains. Coarse grains, meaning it has larger grains. And then looking at felsic, intermediate, mafic, or ultramafic. So our igneous rocks usually can fit into a chart such as this. So you can match up, okay, it looks like it is a mafic rock, which we'll talk about how to determine that. And it has more of a coarse texture rather than a fine texture, so I'm probably looking at gabbro. So another important thing to talk about is what we call fractional crystallization. So I talked about the Bowen's reaction series, and I said that the mafic materials are going to settle out first, for example, olivine. What this means is our crystals are going to be forming in a certain order. So if we think about magma solidifying and cooling into a rock, that's not necessarily a quick process. So there is time for these minerals to grow from the material that's within that magma. So First, we have very, very hot magma. As it starts to solidify, we are going to have mafic minerals crystallizing first, as I mentioned. So, for example, olivine, which is a mafic mineral, is going to crystallize out first. So, originally, the melt here, which is the red, the liquid, let's say, is mafic. But as all of the mafic minerals are crystallizing, they're removing the mafic material from the magma. So those ions required to form the mafic crystals are now going to be solidified. So they will be growing in their crystals. They will often sink down through the liquid magma. What's left over then is more of a felsic magma. So as the temperature cools, the mafic material is settled out. It is crystallized out of the liquid magma. And what's left is a more felsic magma as the temperatures cool. Then there is plenty of felsic material as the temperatures get cool enough for the felsic minerals to begin crystallizing. So here we have another chart showing the sequence of mineral production in this Bowen's reaction series. So here we have ultramafic, mafic, intermediate, and felsic minerals, and we have temperature. So remember, the very first minerals to crystallize out of a cooling and solidifying magma will be the ultramafic and the mafic materials. So they will crystallize first. The felsic materials need a cooler temperature in order to crystallize, meaning that they will start to crystallize last. So now if we think about this backwards, all the examples I've been giving is about a magma cooling and solidifying into an igneous rock, and the minerals that grow as that magma is solidifying. So what if we think about a rock that is melting? So if we are melting some rock into a magma, so the opposite way, the temperatures would start very low, and they would continue to increase as we continue to melt your material. So the first minerals to melt are going to be the felsic materials because they require a lower temperature to be a solid mineral. So as the temperatures increase, the first minerals to melt are going to be the felsic minerals. The last minerals to melt are going to be the ultramafic and mafic minerals that require that really high temperature. So you can look at this chart and this reaction series both ways, both as a magma cooling into a rock and then also a rock melting into magma. So it follows the same order, this same series, and that series is determined by the silica content of the magma or of the rock. So here we have a little breakdown. Here we have our mafic material. It's melting, it's starting to cool. As it cools, that silica poor minerals, they are going to solidify out. So here we have olivine. Olivine is green, so usually it's shown by this green. Olivine is going to settle out. So the leftover still liquid magma is going to become more felsic. As the rest of the magma continues to cool, we will have more of our felsic materials forming. So what we end up with is a combination of all types of minerals within our solidified rock once that magma is completely solidified into an igneous rock. So the minerals, the reason we start with minerals in this class, we look at minerals before we look at rocks, is that the minerals will help identify igneous rocks. So we can look at the minerals within the rocks to help us determine what is that rock made of, how did that rock form, and what type of rock are we looking at. So we can look at very fine-grained texture, and you'll notice there's very small grains, or for some examples, very hard to tell that there even are little grains, versus coarse grains, where there are larger mineral pieces. The minerals have been able to grow larger. We call that coarse-grained, where you can clearly see the difference, the different types of minerals within that rock. And different compositions in terms of felsic versus mafic are going to have different compositions of minerals within them. So all minerals will make up our igneous rock. Igneous rock is any frozen magma or lava. So what I mean by that is any solidified magma or lava. Magma is a molten rock that is underneath the Earth's surface. The only difference between magma and lava is that lava has reached the Earth's surface. So lava is molten rock that has reached the Earth's surface. So there has been some sort of volcanic eruption, and that magma has moved from below the surface up to above the surface. Other than that, lava and magma are the same. So here we have lava. Lava is flowing on the surface of the Earth here, so this is all going to be lava. This is an active lava flow, what we call, it's active because it's still liquid, it's still moving. You can see the lava fountain where the lava is reaching the surface there. This cartoon here shows our magma is underground, and our lava would be above the surface. So we look at both intrusive and extrusive when we are talking about igneous rock. So intrusive is anything that is under the surface of the Earth. Extrusive is above the surface of the Earth. So intrusive igneous rock is any rock that has cooled underground. So an intrusive rock is rock that was made from magma that was cooled and solidified into rock underground. So that rock hardened and solidified into the solid rock underground. It never reached the Earth's surface. Extrusive is rock that has reached the Earth's surface. So extrusive igneous rock is a rock type that was formed from lava, which reached the Earth's surface and solidified on the surface of the Earth. So there's two different types of igneous rock. Intrusive, meaning it formed inside the Earth. Extrusive, meaning it formed outside or on the surface of the Earth. So we talk a lot in this class about the crust and the asthenosphere. We know the crust, the lithosphere, and the asthenosphere from when we talked about plate tectonics. Both the crust and the asthenosphere are mostly solid rock. So most of that material is solid rock. Melting, however, occurs in generally very localized areas. So there have to be specific conditions for melt to actually occur. So it's not that we have melting magma right beneath our thin crust. We do have solid rock beneath our feet, and the melt happens only in very specific conditions in very localized areas. So how do we get melting? How do we form magma and lava that can then form our igneous rocks? There's a couple different ways. So melting can be caused by decompression, meaning that the pressure decreases, but the temperature stays the same. That is going to cause the material to melt. Also, the addition of volatiles. So these elements will break chemical bonds in the rock, which is going to cause melting. And then the third way to cause melting is due to heat transfer. So heat from existing magma can cause melting. So if there's rock around a magma chamber, that rock that's quite close to the magma chamber will often melt due to the heat from that already existing magma. So let's go through these examples in a little more detail. Here we're talking about melting due to decompression. So decompression is where our temperature of our rock stays the same, but the pressure decreases. So the pressure is decreasing, but the temperature stays the same. This is going to cause melting. So here I have a graph that shows this. Here we have position A, so where our rock started, and then it moves to position B. So here we are showing the crust, so the surface of the earth is at the top of the figure, and then as we move down, we're going deeper into the earth with depth. Here we are also seeing pressure, so as we move further from the crust, as we move deeper into the earth, the pressure increases. So there's more of earth above you, your pressure is going to increase. So if we were to decrease pressure for decompression, that means that we are moving rock A from a lower position up closer to the surface of the earth. So this rock is being moved upwards. As it moves up, we're keeping it at about the same temperature. Here's our temperature scale. So the temperature is staying the same. However, as the rock moves upwards with the same temperature now, there's less pressure, temperature is the same, that rock is going to move across the solid line. So this is showing us that as this material moves across this very specific set of conditions here shown by the green line, we are going to induce melting, so that rock will then exist in a liquid state. So if we move rock upwards in terms of from a deeper position in the earth up towards the crust, but the temperature stays the same, there's potential for that material to melt due to this decompression. So this is something that happens where we have magma rising upward. So here we have a mantle plume, for example. As this material gets pushed up from this mantle, we're going to have increased melting. Also, at a continental rift. So remember, a rift is where a continental plate is spreading apart. It's a divergent boundary where our continental plate is spreading apart. So that continental crust is going to get thinner and thinner, which means that the deeper material will be able to rise up to replace it. This deeper material rising up is going to induce melt because it is decreasing its pressure. The third situation where we'd see this type of melting is at a mid-ocean ridge. So mid-ocean ridge, similar to a continental rift, is a divergent boundary. So as the material rises up to take the place of what was erupted at the mid-ocean ridge, we will have extra melting. So this material here in this little box, for example, is going to move up as everything moves up towards the surface. As this mid-ocean ridge continues its seafloor spreading, we will induce extra melting here. So anytime we have material moving up towards the surface of the earth where there's no large change in temperature, we are going to cause melting of that material. So the second way to cause melting is due to volatile material. So these are substances that evaporate very, very easily. So two main examples are carbon dioxide and water. So evaporation in the same location as very hot, dry rock can actually break the chemical bonds of that rock, which causes melting. It's called flux melting. So what's happening here is the evaporation of these substances actually decreases the melting temperature of the surrounding rock. So this is what happens at a subduction zone. So as we have our oceanic plate here subducting underneath our continental crust, this oceanic plate is going to get to a point where it is so hot that the volatile material within it is actually going to immediately evaporate. That evaporation is what causes the melt that we talked about when we talked about plate tectonics. So it's actually this flux melting, these volatiles within the rock that is evaporating, so it's causing this melt. That magma then rises up and creates, in this situation, our continental arc. So this, you might also see this called wet melt. So that would be talking about the melted material that contains those dissolved volatiles. This is another reason why volcanic eruptions often erupt a large amount of gas. So it's not just lava that is erupted at volcanic eruptions. There's a lot of gas also emitted and added to the atmosphere. There's also about 50% water. So those volcanic gases that are erupted at a volcano are generally actually about 50% water. So the last type of melt is called melting due to heat transfer, or just heat transfer melting. So this is where there's already existing very hot magma, and it's going to melt to the rock nearby, creating more magma. So this happens everywhere that we have magma. Everywhere that there's magma underground, it is so hot that it will start to melt the rock around it. So any magma chamber or alley of magma is going to be constantly growing because it will always be melting the magma that surrounds melting the rock that surrounds it. So would magma have an orderly crystalline lattice, the way that we talked about minerals always having an orderly crystalline lattice? The answer is no. So magma is a liquid. There's no ordered structure of magma. Magma does have chains and clusters of ions and molecules that move around, but there is no orderly structure the way that we see in our minerals. So as that magma starts to cool and the minerals start to grow, those minerals will have an ordered structure, but the liquid magma does not. The type of magma depends on the chemical composition. So as we talked about, that percentage of silica, the amount of silica within that magma, is going to tell us which type of magma we're dealing with. Felsic is high silica content. Mafic is low silica content. So there's different melt types. The type of magma is due to the type of rock that melted. So generally, the type of magma is controlled by what was the magma before it melted. So if we have partial melting, that's possible where there's partial melting. That means that the temperature was not high enough to melt the entire source rock. So we might have just the easier to melt materials melted, whereas there is still some solid minerals floating in that partially melted material. We can also have assimilation, which is where you have your magma chamber. It's very, very hot, and it causes partial melting of the magma around it, which is going to mix with this magma and possibly change the composition of the previous magma. So if you are looking at a magma chamber underground, it's going to partially melt those felsic materials. That felsic, now liquid material, is going to add to that magma chamber, causing that massive magma to be a little bit more felsic. We can also have magma mixing, which is where you have different types of magma coming together and combining. So magma moves vertically upwards because it is a liquid. So magma is always going to be less dense than the solid rock. So magma will always try to move upwards. It is always trying to move up to the surface. When it reaches the surface, we call it lava. If it does not reach the surface, we call it magma. Remember that any magma that is solidified underground is an intrusive rock. Any magma that becomes lava by reaching the surface and then solidifying on the surface is called extrusive igneous rock. So when we talk about types of magma, we mentioned felsic versus mafic. We know that controls the silica content, or I should say the silica content controls the type of magma that we consider it to be. That also controls how the magma is going to flow. So the viscosity of the magma or the lava depends on the temperature and the percentage of silica. So if we have a low viscosity magma, it's going to be hotter. It will also be more mafic. A high viscosity magma is generally cooler. It's going to be more felsic. So that low viscosity magma is going to flow a lot more. Like this diagram here, we're going to have flowing lava, versus a high viscosity magma or lava is not going to flow very much. It can actually dome quite a bit and clog up the top of the volcano, causing a much more explosive volcano. So here's a joke I have about volcanoes. The next lecture video, we're going to get into igneous rock types, how this magma solidifies into our igneous rock types, and how to identify the different igneous rocks.